Hi, trade professionals. The Simply Trade News Roundup is back. All of us are back. We have Lalo in the studio and we have Andy back in the studio. Yay! Awesome. Well, last week we had a great conversation with Michelle Schultz. I really loved her. She's a woman and we love women in trade. So, sorry. Um, but I'm excited to get this back on track, and we have loads of good article and questions and stuff. But first, I want to mention something. We have reached 10K downloads, and I'm so excited. And it's a little applause for these two because they're doing obviously most of the work, and it's something that we have been looking forward for, or we didn't know if we would achieve it in the first year. And Lalo set this goal, and you know what? We made it. So thank you to the listeners because obviously we couldn't do it without you. And what else? Oh yeah, we're striving for 20,000, right? Till the end of the year. Hopefully. So keep listening. And obviously let us know if we can do anything better or what you want to see next. That way we can, count on your listen. So moving on. So moving along, we have some news to share. And the first article, we're talking China's coming back. China doesn't leave the news. And obviously, we have to cover it. So, Biden orders ban on new investments in China's sensitive high tech industry. So, they were talking about stabilizing the relationship with China. Obviously, you're banning some stuff that'll hurt China, and China doesn't like it. So, I'm confused about that. That's number one. And then, what do you think it'll do from here? Like, how are they going to proceed? And I really don't understand how they're using de-risking as a term here, because they're saying that they're de-risking the situation when China is not really in favor for it. So I feel like it would be more risk. But anyway, so please enlighten me.
Is that you've got two parties here, U.S. and China in this sense, actually China and dealing with the rest of the world. So there's several things that go on with this, but remember China and Russia were both added to the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Part of the requirements of the WTO to become a member of that organization is you are to promote, I guess, free trade, which means you have to open up your own economy. And second, you are to be looking at reducing tariffs. So with that, the scenario I look at it is not only free trade, but fair trade. So here's where we are at. China has not opened up their economy. There are so many restrictions and things of that nature, and they definitely have not gone on a reducing tariffs. However, counter to that, China has had full access to the U.S. for decades now. China has become a much more aggressive competitor on the global market. Now, whether you like China or not, I mean, they're taking steps that are pro-China. I understand that, just like the U.S. or anybody else should be pro their own country. But in this scenario here is that, quite frankly, it can be labeled that China has not been playing fair in the global economies and whatnot. So, in other words, there has been a problem with intellectual property rights. The U.S. administration, the Biden administration now, is taking steps to say we need to restrict certain commodities and investment in China because when you invest over there, they're using that same investment and technology and all of that against the U.S. So it's detrimental to the U.S. economy.
I guess I guess what I'm getting out of this is like respecting each other. Like if you're disrespecting our product, then we have to take it away. It's not, because I was seeing it as a way of, you're making the situation worse, but basically you do have to set boundaries. And respect towards what's yours. And, if we were to do the same with China, they would obviously get upset.
Well, and to that point, I mean, Lalo, I would say this is in the technology realm. So when we're talking about some of these specialized semiconductors and things of that nature, as far as the advancement of the design and development of new semiconductors, by restricting that over there, I mean, what's the positives for the U.S. or negatives in that in this realm?
Well, what I saw here actually was more on the side of where it seems like China is even more upset about it more than anything is that they invest or bring business or resources to the United States so that they can, whether they open companies or research or whatever here in the United States, the executive order pretty much says not only are you companies restricted from investing in China, like in physically in China. It's also restricting investment in the United States of companies that are involved in China.
With Chinese partnership with Chinese companies. Yeah, okay, yeah, you're right on that one. I forgot about that piece.
Yeah, so that's a big problem because again, a Chinese company can come here and they have venture capitalists, they have investment. I mean, you name it, who are trying to build and create new business with whoever it might be. I mean, in this case, let's just very specifically, let's just say China, because that's what the executive order is on. So you're not allowed to do that anymore. So all these like chip manufacturing, semiconductor. I mean, pretty much. I mean, gosh, AI, all the buzzwords of today. Everything that is just pretty much making technology hum today. That has stopped if you are a Chinese company or Chinese somehow connections. Going forward, you are not able to. If you're a U.S. company, you're not able to invest in that venture anymore. It does not restrict investment or I mean ongoing investments. Like if you already invested last week, then you're lucky. you got in. You're not going to be nothing's going to happen to you. In other words, yeah.
Well, something to look at, and I guess to monitor. Well, we're moving on to Article 2, and I guess this is also a problem for China, I feel like. We have a lots of going on with China, I guess. I feel sorry for them, or do I? I don't know. Um, this this one is Congress asserts its trade authority with Taiwan trade deal. Yeah, I was a little confused about this because I wasn't sure why they seem to be fighting a little bit, or I guess there seemed to be a problem. But anyways, so overall I want to discuss the situation and what is happening exactly. Does Congress and the executive branch have different ideas of this trade deal, and also how will this affect the future, good or bad?
I will say this: there's always been this scenario where the Congress ultimately has the authority on ratifying trade agreements that have been negotiated. Are they good? They're bad? Those kinds of things. So it has the ultimate authority to say if an agreement has been negotiated by the executive branch or by it'd be from the executive branch basically, and through their um, uh, representatives. Um, that agreement has to come back, and then Congress has the overall approval to say, yes, we want to enter into this agreement, or no, we don't. Now, that said, Congress has that authority. Where the challenge here is that the president should and has been given some authority to negotiate those trade deals. It got very bureaucratic. I think it was towards the late 70s and into the 80s, and it was finally changed in late 80s to allow the president. I think it was under the Clinton administration where it finally became law and approval, to allow the president and the executive branch to literally negotiate a trade deal, because it was getting bogged down in both the House and the Senate and all the messes going on to try and negotiate something. When you got too many people in, it's like, look, let's come up with something. So the president and the executive branch were given the authority to negotiate with other countries on trade deals.
Wait, TEA, what is that? TEA.
It stands for Trade Executive Agreement. So the executive branch negotiated a trade agreement, is what it is, versus an overall established trade agreement like the U.S. MCA, U.S. Mexico Canadian agreement. That's a trade agreement. It's not but initially you had TEAs that were issued because in principle, this is what we're looking at, and then Congress approves it. The Biden administration right now seems to be using TEAs to circumvent Congress's approval, and it's unfortunate. So there's this battle.
Yeah, you know what? What I remembered is that last time we talked about this too. I mean, a while back we talked about Taiwan, and it was actually the same thing I remembered. It was the whole piece that they're going to trade, the way they're going to trade, blah, 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 blah. And it's funny because it took them so long, and I thought it would already be established, or, something was happening, but they're still at this point where they're so confused.
Yeah, I think what we were talking about back then is them negotiating this agreement that they just approved. So basically, back then we were talking about how Congress and the U.S. was talking about this agreement, establishing this agreement, but it was just an idea at that time, and now it's actually done. So, and anyway, it's just pretty much saying Congress is saying, hey, like Andy said, let's just play by the rules. Go ahead and um, let us do what we're supposed to do, but you can go ahead and also help negotiate the agreements. And Biden is kind of going a little bit off track there, and he's saying, well, I don't know, if I don't like the rules, I may not follow them, and I don't want them to limit my ability to do negotiations. So, but anyway, so that's what's going on.
Yeah. And you know what? We have the third article, and I don't know if that maybe ties into what you're saying. Not this article directly, but kind of what you're saying about these trade deals, because we're talking about importing and exporting, and the exact headline is U.S. trade deficit shrinks as imports hit more than 1 to 1.5 year low. And it's funny because I basically was Googling or researching more about trade deficits, because I understand what it's saying, but I don't understand what it actually means, or if it's good or bad. Looked it up, and it said it's neither. So that's funny. But maybe you can give me more about that right now. And so one thing it said is that, first of all, on a good note, it seemed that the economy grew at a 2.4 annualized rate in April to June quarter, which seems good, right? That's a positive thing. And then I want to talk about the trade deficit, though. So what does this mean for the United States? I do understand that demand is low, because we've talked about this many times, that people just don't have the money to spend or don't want to spend it because things are getting so expensive. But does this mean we're in a rut, this trade deficit? Does it mean that we're getting out of a rut? Does it mean we're barely starting? What is your take on this? And let's define the trade deficit situation.
Well, first off, people hear about trade deficits and it gets lost in the overall scheme of things. So what does a trade deficit mean? A deficit means that in this particular case, the U.S. is importing more goods than we export. Okay. So there's a deficit. In other words, if we were exporting more goods than we import, it would be a trade surplus, that we are selling more U.S. goods around the world than we import foreign goods. So in this case, the trade deficit has been a big deal. So here's where I go with this, though, is that this gets into another scenario. It's like when the trade deficit is reduced, that means instead of, let's say, $70 billion, we have imported $70 billion more than we exported. Well, it's saying that we're down to 68.3 billion in the trade deficit. That means that we've imported $2 billion less than we exported. in the overall. So in other words, 68.3 billion in this article is is the trade deficit.
No, it does help. I understand it because I mean, I understand you explained it better than what I was reading, but I did you kind of I guess agreed with what I was reading because of the whole trade deficit. Like it seems like a scary thing, but it really has no meaning if it's good or bad. Because that actually brings me to an interesting fact I had for today, and I guess I'm going to bring it up now. Because do you know who has the biggest trade deficit in the world?
Well, that's a good question. I have no
We do.
idea. I figured
Yeah,
the U.S. did,
yeah,
but
the U.S.
Yeah.
does. And it's in 2018. It was where was it? 621 billion.
yes. Now that much I will say that is which lends itself that I will say, now this is a personal opinion, folks. So this is Andy Shiles talking here. When I look at these trade numbers, and you know, at one point it was 478 billion, then it got up to 678 billion, and all that in a trade deficit in for the whole year. When you look at that, we are sacrificing U.S. jobs for cheap imports, is what that boils down to. That's one thing. The second thing is that U.S. goods, in my personal opinion, have not been treated fairly abroad. What does that mean? Is that people in other countries want full access to the U.S. market, and we open as like we're for free trade, and you know, reduction of tariffs and things of that nature. Well, back to the original thing is that the trade deficit in this case has been reduced in a 3-month quarter, I think, or no, excuse me, a 1-month quarter, 1 more month period. Good night. I can't even get it right. So in 1 month, instead of a $69 billion trade deficit, it came in at 68.3. So a little less than $1 billion that it shrunk, and all, but overall trade also was reduced. So I would just tell you that in this, when you're talking through this, there's other complexities behind that come into play where you're wanting to stimulate trade. Stimulation of trade is going to generate jobs. So that's where it looks like.
Well, I understand. But either way, it said that the economy grew at a 2.4 annualized rate in April to June quarter. So that's good. So we're going to end it with that because that's a good note. Um, whether it's good or bad to you. But anyways, so thank you guys for listening. This was great. Again, I got some lots of intel on these things, and I know they're hot and cold topics or could be hot and cold topics, but overall we got the compliance and trade part of the way, and I feel like I definitely understand it a bit better than I did before, and it's much better than Googling it. So if you try to Google, you don't really get answers. You can get the answers from Lalo and Andy. That's what I'm telling you. So don't even worry about Googling. You don't need it anymore. um Anyways, so again, thank you guys for 10K listeners. Woo, I'm so excited. And thank you, Andy and Lalo. And we're going to go check out the surprise that's going to come into the room. But before, we're going to have to end this episode. And you guys can look at what the surprise was on our LinkedIn. So thank you again. And we will see you next week. If you have any articles, let me know.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest in the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.